The wind blew hard that afternoon in Zorah. The sun cast its golden light over the fields, while a lonely woman walked around her home, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She carried a heavy silence within her, the silence of a womb that had never known the cry of a child. Then something unexpected happened. A light, soft but intense, shone before her. A majestic figure appeared, and his voice carried the force of thunder and the sweetness of the breeze at the same time. "Behold, you will conceive and bear a son." The words pierced her soul like a sword. A son? Her? But how? And before she could react, she heard more. "He will be a Nazirite, separated from birth. He will not cut his hair, he will not drink wine, and he will be the deliverer of Israel." Her heart raced. Such a calling was not common. This child would not be just a son. He would be an instrument of God himself, a warrior destined to face the enemies of his people. But what if he didn't accept this destiny? As his mind tried to absorb everything, a question hung in the air. Would this chosen son honor his calling, or would he get lost along the way? The answer began to take shape years later, when a boy with bright eyes and unusual strength began to show that his story would be anything but ordinary. The years passed, and that boy grew up. But Samson was not like the other boys in the village. Since he was little, his strength had already manifested itself in inexplicable ways. One time, while playing in the fields, a huge stone blocked his path. While the other boys walked away, laughing at the impossibility, Samson simply planted his feet on the ground, clenched his fists, and lifted the stone as if it were a dry twig. The looks of astonishment followed him wherever he went. He was a mystery even to his own parents. But his mother never forgot the words of that celestial visitor. There were rules. There was a pact. Samson was a Nazirite set apart for God, and his strength was not just a gift, it was a sign of a greater purpose. He could not cut his hair. He could not touch anything unclean. He could not drink wine. Each of these restrictions was a reminder that he belonged not to himself, but to something much greater. But did he understand this? Because as his muscles grew and his fame spread, another side emerged, an impulsive side, a defiant side. And then came the first real test, a decision that would forever change the course of his life. It was on a journey that Samson saw something that made his heart race. But it was not an enemy. It was not a threat. On the contrary, it was a captivating look, a face he could not forget. And without thinking twice, he made a decision, one that his parents would never approve of. Samson had never felt anything like it before. His heart was beating fast, his hands were tingling, and a certainty formed in his mind. He wanted her. No matter what anyone said, no matter what was written in the law of his people, he wanted that woman. She was a Philistine, the daughter of his enemies. But Samson saw no boundaries, no consequences. He returned home determined, looked into his parents' eyes and declared, "I want you to get me that woman as a wife." The silence fell like a stone. His mother exchanged a distressed look with his father, who frowned and retorted, "Is there no woman among our people? Why look among the Philistines?" But Samson did not want to hear. "She pleases me. She is the one I want." And so it was done. The wedding was arranged, and Samson walked towards enemy territory, full of confidence. But destiny was already whispering something that he could not hear. On the way, something unexpected happened. A roar echoed through the fields. A young lion emerged from the shadows, eyes blazing, ready to attack. An ordinary man would have fled, but Samson felt fire rise through his body. The Spirit of the Lord took hold of him, and before the animal could pounce, he lunged. His bare hands found the lion's flesh, and with one blow he tore it in half, as if it were a piece of cloth. The body was left behind, abandoned in the dust of the road. Samson told no one. He simply walked on, never looking back. But what he did not know was that this encounter with the lion would only be the harbinger of something much greater, a mystery, a betrayal, and a fury that would turn his marriage into tragedy. The wedding feast lasted 7 days, as was the custom. The hall was filled with laughter, music, and the raising of glasses. But at the center of it all was Samson, a defiant gleam in his eyes. He liked a good game, to measure strength not only with his fists, but with his mind. So he stood up before the 30 Philistine guests and issued a challenge. "I will propose a riddle. If you can find the answer in 7 days, I will give each of you a new tunic. But if you can't, you will give me 30 tunics." The men looked at each other, laughing. A riddle from a Hebrew? Easy. "Tell us," they challenged. Samson smiled. "From the eater came food, and from the strong came sweetness." The Philistines were confused. What did this mean? They thought and argued, but the days passed and the answer did not come. They began to taste the bitter taste of defeat until they had an idea. If they couldn't get the answer out of Samson, then they would get it out of her. They went to Samson's wife. They pressured her. "If you don't tell us, we'll burn you and your father's house." Fear set in. She knew what the Philistines were capable of, so she did what she had to do. On the last night of the feast, she lay down next to Samson and whispered in a sweet voice, "If you really love me, tell me the secret of the riddle." Samson tried to resist, but it was like facing a storm without shelter. She insisted, cried, begged. On the 7th day, he gave in. "It's the honey I found on the carcass of the lion I killed." And so, without him knowing, his words were delivered to his enemies. At the last minute of the deadline, the Philistines came to him with victorious smiles. "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" Betrayal burned inside Samson like fire. He clenched his fists, feeling the anger rise to his chest. They had deceived him, and Samson never accepted being deceived without fighting back. He left without saying anything, but with a firm purpose in his eyes. And what happened next transformed a simple fury into a storm of revenge. Samson walked like a man possessed. His chest heaved, his muscles tensed with each step, and his mind repeated one thing: "They deceived me." The betrayal was like a hot iron burning his honor. He was not just any man. He was God's chosen one, a Nazirite, a warrior, and now a betrayed husband. But Samson was never one to just complain. He went down to Ashkelon, a Philistine city, and there his fury exploded. 30 men fell before his hands, without even having time to understand what hit them. When the last body fell, he tore off his clothes and took the tunics back to pay the bet. But there was no celebration, no relief. He felt the bitter taste of humiliation. Samson had been deceived, used, and it would not stay that way. With his heart on fire, he returned home. He needed to see his wife. He needed to understand how she had the courage to betray him like that. But when he arrived, he found only emptiness. His father-in-law looked at him with regret and said what Samson would never have expected to hear. "I thought you had abandoned her, so I gave her to another man." The world around Samson seemed to shake. He could barely breathe. They had stolen his honor. Now they had stolen his wife. And it was at that moment that something inside him changed. If before Samson had been a man driven by desire, now he would be a man driven by fury. He left there, but not to mourn. He had a plan, and when he returned, the Philistines would feel the weight of the wrath of a man who would not accept being ridiculed. Samson roamed the fields like a wounded lion. The blood pounded in his temples, and the desire for revenge burned within him like live coals. They had betrayed him, they had mocked him, but Samson was not a man to suffer in silence. He would return the favor. And then he had an idea, wild, unpredictable, devastating. He went hunting for foxes. Yes, foxes. 200 of them. He hunted them one by one, capturing them with his bare hands. And when he had gathered them all, he did the unthinkable. He tied their tails together in pairs and fastened flaming torches between them. Then, with a cold look, he released them into the midst of the Philistines' crops. The fire spread like a ravenous beast. Flames danced over the wheat fields, over the vineyards, over the olive trees. What had been gold turned to ash in a matter of minutes. The entire Philistine harvest was devoured by the fire of vengeance. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. The flames were rising to the sky, lighting up the night with a hellish glare. And there was no doubt who was responsible. The Philistines were furious. They could not allow a single man to humiliate them in such a way. And in response, they did something even crueler. They went to the house of Samson's father-in-law and burned it all down, with him and his daughter inside. Revenge had brought about a new tragedy, and now Samson was no longer just a betrayed man. He was a man with nothing to lose. He turned against the Philistines like a storm of destruction. This time there would be no foxes. There would be no fire. Only the brute force of a man who no longer recognized limits. The smell of ashes still hung in the air when Samson learned what the Philistines had done. They had killed his wife. They had burned his house. They had destroyed everything. Samson's heart no longer ached. Now there was only an emptiness filled with one thing: rage. He did not plan. He did not strategize. He just went. Alone, like a storm in the flesh, he invaded the lands of the Philistines and descended upon them with a fury that no one could contain. Blows fell like thunder. Bones snapped like dry twigs. Men fell in heaps with no chance to fight back. When the dust settled, dozens were dead, and those who survived fled in terror, carrying with them a single message: Samson is not a man. He is a force of nature. But he knew it would not end there. The Philistines would never accept such humiliation. They would come back, and they would come back in force. So Samson retreated to the cave of Etam. There, alone among the rocks, he waited. Meanwhile, the Philistines marched against Judah. They didn't just want revenge. They wanted the Israelites themselves to hand Samson over to them. The men of Judah, terrified, sent 3,000 of their own warriors to the cave. They weren't there to fight alongside Samson. They were there to capture him. Samson, don't you understand? The Philistines rule over us. Now they want you. We have no choice. We will tie you up and hand you over, or they will destroy everything. Samson looked at his own brothers, those who were supposed to fight by his side, betrayed again. Abandoned, but he did not struggle against the inevitable. Do what you must do, but promise me one thing: you will not kill me yourselves. They promised, and so they tied up the strongest man in the land like a lamb going to the slaughter. The Philistines waited outside, ready to see him humiliated, ready to see the lion turn into prey. But little did they know that no chains can hold a man marked by God. Samson was tied up, his arms stretched out, the chains tightening his skin. But inside, the flame of revenge still burned. He had been betrayed, sold by his own brothers, and delivered into the hands of his enemies. They looked at him as if he were nothing, a helpless prisoner. But inside him, the Spirit of God still burned like a lit torch. Samson knew he was not there by chance. He had not been chosen to live as a slave. And when the Philistines brought him to the temple of Dagon to mock him in front of a crowd, something changed. The void in his chains was filled with something greater. He asked the young man who was guiding him to take him to the central pillars of the temple. It didn't seem like a grand gesture, just a simple request, but at that moment, Samson knew exactly what he would do. The Philistines laughed at him, humiliated him, made him the center of their fun. But without saying a word, he approached the pillars with a silent strength that began to grow within him. It was there, in the center of that temple, that everything would change. The Philistines did not know that they were about to witness the greatest display of power that had ever existed. Samson would not use his hands. He would use something much stronger. He would use his faith. With a superhuman effort, he did the unthinkable. He pushed the pillars. The sound of the impact was like thunder, a roar that shook the very ground. But as the columns began to give way, the sky seemed to open. The temple collapsed on top of them all. Samson, with the weight of the building on him, knew that his journey would not end there, but the final test of his strength would be the last thing the Philistines would see. The last breath he would take would be that of justice. Deep down, Samson knew He would fulfill his calling, even if victory cost everything. And the Philistines would pay the price for underestimating him. The temple of Dagon was in ruins. The ground, once vibrant with the mockery of the Philistines, was now an abyss of rubble and silence. Samson's last roar reverberated off the falling walls, like thunder fading into silence. He lay among the rubble, his eyes closed, but his mission was accomplished. But in the hearts of the Philistines, Samson's victory was not just a physical defeat. It was a loss of honor, of power. Without him, they felt vulnerable, exposed. That night of humiliation was the harbinger of something much greater, the end of their domination over Israel. Samson, even in death, had become the flame that would ignite them. His fall did not mean defeat, but a call to those who were on the fringes of their faith. The God of Israel had not forgotten. The story of Samson echoed on everyone's lips, a legend of a man who, even in the shadows, knew what his destiny was. He was not a victim of his own arrogance or brute strength. He was the storm that prepared the ground for a new beginning. And as the earth calmed, what was about to happen began to form between the lines of the story. Because when stones fall, it is so that the seed can grow. And those who thought Samson had lost may not yet understand that his greatest victory was yet to come. In the stillness after the storm, when the last ashes had dissipated and the murmurs of the crowd had died down, Samson's name continued to echo, not as the man who was defeated, but as the symbol of something greater. A man who defied the odds, defied death itself, and in the end gave himself up for something greater than himself. The Philistines had lost much more than a battle. Samson's death represented the loss of his authority, the fall of what seemed unshakable. But like all great leaders, Samson left a legacy that would endure far beyond his own lifetime. His story spread by word of mouth, inspiring those who were once lost to rise up and reclaim what had been taken from them. Israel would rise again. Samson would not be remembered simply as the man who destroyed a temple, but for what he represented. His strength lay in his purpose, and his purpose was to restore what had been corrupted. The Spirit of God that guided him, even in his darkest hours, would not disappear with his death. And as the generations passed, Samson's name became synonymous with resilience. He was not just a hero of his time, but an archetype for all who would ever feel oppressed, broken, or crushed by the weight of the world. Samson proved that even in the worst circumstances, true strength does not come from what you see with your eyes, but from what you carry inside. But there was still more to his story, something that was about to be revealed, something that would make him seen in a completely new way. Samson's story was known for its brutality and the overwhelming power he possessed. But there was something that few understood, something that was buried between the lines of his life, something that went unnoticed by everyone, the mystery of the true source of his strength. During his journey, many had attributed his power to superhuman muscles, to a nearly immortal body. Others spoke of the strength that emerged as a natural gift, as a divine gift that made him invincible. But the truth was much deeper than anyone could imagine. At the most critical moments of his life, Samson found himself questioned, not only by the Philistines, but by the Israelites themselves. Where does this strength come from? This question came up often, but he never gave a clear answer. He knew that human eyes would never understand the true source of his strength, for it was not his flesh that generated it, but his faith, his relationship with God, his commitment to the divine calling. It was faith that kept him standing. It was his obedience to the Lord that renewed his strength when it seemed all was lost. Even in the worst situations, he knew he was not alone. He was God's instrument, a broken tool that would still fulfill the Creator's purpose. That is why when he asked for the strength to pull down the pillars of the temple, it was not just his flesh that moved. It was his soul, his belief, his total surrender to what had been promised. He was not just breaking the structure of the Philistine temple, he was breaking the limits of the impossible. And as the great temple of Dagon crumbled under the weight of his action, there was something beyond the falling stones, something mystical, almost invisible, but immeasurable. A spiritual transformation was underway, one that extended to those who would hear the story and see the power of God manifest in someone like him, a man who was imperfect but immensely used. The mystery of his strength was never just about his muscles or his hair, but about his connection to the divine, about the eternal struggle between weakness and power. And that is where, even after his death, the impact of his strength extended far beyond his actions. Over time, Samson's death became a story told by everyone, but what no one knew was how much the man who had fallen had truly changed. He was no longer just an indomitable warrior, but a broken man who knew the cost of arrogance and disobedience. His story of fall, however, did not end like that of many heroes. He did not rise for one last triumphant act of revenge. He rose to fulfill a calling that reached beyond his own life. It was difficult to look at Samson and see in him any trace of the majesty he had once displayed. His eyes were blind, his hands were captive, and the earth beneath him no longer shook with power, but with a silent, spiritual weight. But Samson's true transformation did not come in the final battle against the Philistines, but in the moments of reflection he experienced during his imprisonment. Each day, each minute of weakness was a reminder of his failures, but also of how he could still surrender himself to the greater purpose God had for him. When Samson cried out for strength, it wasn't just for revenge, it was for redemption. He no longer wanted to prove his strength to others. He wanted to do the Lord's will. Every move he made, every slip he had on his journey was a preparation for this moment of total surrender. And as the temple fell, he no longer saw himself as a man alone, but as a servant who had finally submitted to the divine plan. The strength that had once been his was now a gift, a final sacrifice. And as the Philistines succumbed to the rubble, Samson surrendered himself to the will of God with a quiet wisdom, knowing that even in death he had fulfilled his mission. But what about the others? What would happen to those who had scorned him? When the last tremor had ceased and the dust of the wreckage had finally settled, the temple of Dagon was nothing more than a memory, a distant echo of a power that no longer existed. But Samson's death was more than the end of an era. It was the beginning of something much greater. As the Philistines, now defeated, retreated into the shadows of fear, there was a voice that echoed in the heart of every Israelite. This was no ordinary man. This was the man who fulfilled the calling. Samson's sacrifice had marked a turning point, not only in the destiny of Israel, but in everyone's understanding of what power truly meant. Samson's true strength lay not in his muscles, nor even in his victories, but in what he was able to leave behind. What no one could see at that moment was the impact his life would have on generations to come. His legacy was not just that of a man of extraordinary abilities, but that of someone who, even in failure, managed to surrender himself to God's purpose, achieving something that many would never understand, the victory that comes from personal sacrifice. His life would become a legend, and his death an eternal lesson. With each passing generation, the Israelites looked to Samson's story not as a simple hero's tale, but as a call to something deeper, the courage to fight even in the face of failure. Samson's story was proof that even the most broken can be used to fulfill great purposes. And as the cycle of history continued, the question remained, what in fact lies behind Samson's legacy? Who would rise up now to live up to this example and turn one man's fall into a victory for all? The answer was yet to come, and it was greater than anyone could have anticipated. If you liked this video, follow the channel to discover more stories about the Bible, this gem of yours, and follow our work.